I stood in front of the mirror, staring at a woman I barely recognized. The soft lines around my eyes told stories of laughter that had long faded. My once firm skin had surrendered to time, and my hair, though well kept, lacked the luster it once had. I was 58 years old, and for the first time in my life, I truly felt it. I ran a hand down the silk nightgown that used to excite my husband. Now, it was just another piece of fabric, another forgotten effort. I turned away from my reflection with a sigh and climbed into bed beside Daniel. He was already asleep, his breathing deep and steady, his back turned to me like always. It hadn't always been this way. Daniel and I had been married for 32 years. When we first met, he was charming, attentive, and passionate. We built a life together, raised 2 beautiful children, and shared dreams that once felt limitless. But somewhere along the way, we stopped seeing each other. He became consumed with work, and I became the woman who kept the house running. My days revolved around cooking, cleaning, and waiting for him to come home, only for him to barely acknowledge me. Our conversations were routine, predictable. How was work? Fine. Dinner is ready. I'll eat later. The silence between us became heavier than words ever could. I tried to revive us. I planned date nights, wore perfume he used to love, even suggested we go on a trip together. But he always had an excuse. And slowly I gave up trying. I wasn't miserable, but I wasn't happy either. I was just existing. Then one afternoon I met him. It started in the most ordinary way. I had developed a habit of visiting the community library a few times a week. It was peaceful, a quiet escape from the empty house. I would find a cozy corner, sip my tea, and lose myself in books that transported me to worlds far more exciting than my own. That day, I was browsing the shelves when I felt someone's presence nearby. I turned my head and found myself locking eyes with a young man. He was tall, with sun-kissed skin and dark hair that fell effortlessly over his forehead. His hazel eyes held an easy confidence, and his lips curled into a boyish grin as he caught me looking. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said, his voice warm and friendly. I forced a polite smile. "You didn't?" He glanced at the book in my hands. "That's a great one. Classic literature?" I looked down at the worn pages of Pride and Prejudice and chuckled. "I suppose I have a soft spot for romance." "Good taste," he said. "I'm Ryan, by the way." I hesitated for a second before replying, "Esther." Ryan. A simple name, yet it would soon become the most dangerous word in my vocabulary. The next time I saw him, it was purely by chance. Or at least, that's what I told myself. I was sitting by the library window, flipping through pages but barely reading. I felt a presence settle into the seat across from me. Looking up, I saw that same playful grin. "Fancy meeting you here," Ryan said. I smiled despite myself. "Do you come here often?" "As often as my assignments allow. I'm studying psychology," he said, stretching slightly. "Senior year." I blinked. "He's in college." He must have noticed my hesitation because he chuckled. "Let me guess. You were expecting an old professor?" I laughed softly. "Maybe." From that moment, conversation flowed effortlessly. He asked about my favorite books, my thoughts on love stories, and what brought me to the library so often. And I told him. I told him about my love for reading, how I used to dream of traveling but never got the chance, how I felt like I had spent my entire life being someone's wife, someone's mother, but never just me. And he listened. Really listened. Daniel hadn't asked about my interests in years, yet here was this young man, hanging on to my every word. It was harmless, I told myself. Just conversation. But something inside me stirred. Something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt seen. That evening, as I stood in my kitchen preparing dinner, I caught myself humming. It was a strange thing. I hadn't felt light-hearted in ages, yet here I was, smiling over something as simple as a conversation. Daniel walked in, barely sparing me a glance before taking his seat at the table. "You're in a good mood?" he muttered. "Am I?" I replied, stirring the soup. He didn't push the conversation further. He never did. As we ate in silence, my mind wandered back to Ryan's laugh, the way his eyes lit up when he spoke. I should have felt guilty, but I didn't. I felt alive. I told myself it was just a harmless friendship. I had convinced myself that I wasn't doing anything wrong. It was just conversation, just company, something I had been starved of for years. But deep down, I knew better. Ryan and I continued to meet at the library. At first, our conversations were light: books, travel, his studies. But as the weeks passed, we drifted into deeper territory. He told me about his dreams of becoming a psychologist, of helping people navigate their emotions. I envied him. At 24, he had his whole life ahead of him, while I felt like mine had already been spent. And yet, when I was with him, I didn't feel 58. I didn't feel like a housewife forgotten by time. I felt like a woman. One afternoon, as I reached for a book on the top shelf, Ryan stepped behind me. His fingers brushed mine as he helped pull it down. For a moment, we stood too close. I could feel the warmth of his body behind me, the faint scent of his cologne. It was a simple touch, yet it sent a shiver down my spine. I turned to thank him, but the words caught in my throat. His eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time, there was something unspoken between us. A pull, a tension I wasn't ready to acknowledge. A few days later, he asked me to join him for coffee. I hesitated. It was one thing to talk in the library, surrounded by books and people, but coffee felt different. More personal, more dangerous. Still, I found myself saying yes. We met at a small cafe near the university. The air was rich with the scent of roasted beans, and soft jazz played in the background. Ryan was already waiting when I arrived, his face lighting up the moment he saw me. "Glad you made it," he said, standing to pull out my chair. I smiled, feeling a flutter in my stomach I hadn't felt in years. I almost didn't. "Why?" I hesitated before answering. "Because this feels different." His eyes studied me for a moment. Different isn't always bad. I stirred my coffee, avoiding his gaze. "It can be." Ryan leaned in slightly. "Esther, can I be honest with you?" I met his eyes, my pulse quickening. "Of course." "You're beautiful." I let out a soft, nervous laugh. "Ryan." "I mean it," he said, his voice firm. "I don't know if anyone tells you that often, but you should hear it every day." I felt my breath hitch. Daniel hadn't called me beautiful in years. Not even when I dressed up for our anniversary. Not when I wore his favorite dress. Not when I tried so hard to remind him that I was still here. But here was Ryan, saying it so effortlessly, like it was the most natural thing in the world. I should have stopped him. I should have pushed my chair back, thanked him for the coffee, and walked away. But I didn't. Instead, I sat there, letting his words settle into the cracks of my neglected heart. That night, as I lay beside Daniel, I felt restless. My husband's familiar scent, once comforting, now felt foreign. I turned onto my side, staring at the ceiling, replaying Ryan's words in my head. You should hear it every day. I had spent decades devoted to my family, ensuring that everyone had what they needed. But what about me? Didn't I deserve to feel wanted? To feel seen? I wasn't sure when I fell asleep, but when I did, my dreams weren't of Daniel. They were of Ryan. Have you ever done something you swore you'd never do? If you think this is intense, just wait. Things are about to get complicated. Make sure you like and subscribe because the best or the worst is yet to come. A week later, I saw him again. This time, he didn't wait for me at the library. He texted me. "Meet me at my place. I want to show you something." My fingers hovered over the screen, my heart pounding. I should have said no. I should have ignored the message, deleted his number, and never looked back. But instead, I found myself typing, "Send me the address." His apartment was small but cozy. The moment I stepped inside, I was surrounded by the scent of fresh coffee and something warm, like vanilla and cinnamon. "Nice place," I said, glancing around. Ryan smiled, watching me closely. "I wanted to show you something," he said, walking over to his bookshelf. He pulled out a book and handed it to me. It was a first edition of Wuthering Heights. I ran my fingers over the worn leather cover. "It's beautiful." "You told me once that this was your favorite novel," he said. "I thought you might want to borrow it." I looked up at him, stunned. Daniel never remembered the little things. He never cared enough to. Ryan did. I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Thank you, Ryan. This means a lot." He stepped closer, his voice softer now. "You mean a lot." I should have stepped back. I should have put distance between us. But I didn't. I stayed. And when he reached out, his fingers brushing against mine, I didn't pull away. I let it happen. I let myself fall. Because for the first time in years, I wasn't just someone's wife, someone's mother. I was a woman, and I wanted to be wanted. I never thought I'd be the kind of woman who cheated. I used to look at women like that with judgment, shaking my head at their weakness, their recklessness. But I understand now. Cheating doesn't begin in the bedroom. It begins in the mind. It begins with longing, with loneliness, with the smallest of temptations that grow into something uncontrollable. And once you cross that line, there's no turning back. I sat in Ryan's apartment, the first edition of Wuthering Heights resting in my lap, my heart racing. His fingers still lingered against mine, the warmth of his touch sending electric currents through my body. I should have left. I should have smiled, thanked him for the book, and walked out the door. But when I looked up at him, those hazel eyes watching me, that boyish grin replaced by something deeper, more intense, I couldn't move. Not away from him. Not away from this. I felt his fingers travel slowly up my arm, grazing my skin with just enough pressure to make my breath hitch. He was testing me, seeing if I would stop him. I didn't. And that was all the permission he needed. Our lips met in a soft, hesitant kiss. But hesitation lasted only a moment. Then the floodgates burst open. It was desperate, hungry, a collision of need and forbidden desire. His hands were on my waist, pulling me closer, and I felt his warmth, his strength. I let go, of my fears, of my marriage, of the guilt that I knew would come later. Because right now, I wasn't 58. I wasn't a wife, neglected and forgotten. I was a woman being kissed like she was the most desirable thing in the world. And God, it felt good. Hours later, I lay in his bed, tangled in sheets that weren't my own, my body still humming from the aftershocks of what we had done. Ryan traced circles on my shoulder, his breath warm against my neck. "You okay?" he murmured. I swallowed, staring at the ceiling. "I don't know." "Do you regret it?" I turned my head to face him. His expression was open, vulnerable. I thought about Daniel, about the life I had built over 3 decades. I thought about how it had taken only a few months for Ryan to undo all of it. Did I regret it? Maybe I should have. But as I looked into his eyes, I knew the truth. "No," I whispered. A slow smile spread across his lips. "Good." And then he kissed me again, and I let him. For weeks, we lived in our own secret world. Mornings were spent pretending to be the devoted wife, the woman who smiled as she made coffee for a husband who barely looked up from his newspaper. Afternoons were stolen moments in Ryan's apartment, tangled limbs and whispered confessions, a passion so intense it felt like a dream. Nights were the hardest, because I would lie beside Daniel, feeling the weight of my betrayal settle in. But even then, when I closed my eyes, it wasn't my husband I was thinking about. It was Ryan, the way he touched me, the way he made me feel, the way he saw me. And every time I thought about ending it, I found myself craving more of him, more of the fire that had been reignited inside me. I was addicted, and addictions never end well. One evening, as I lay in Ryan's bed, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. I ignored it. He pressed a kiss to my shoulder. "Aren't you going to check that?" "It's probably nothing." But the buzzing continued. Something in my gut twisted. I reached for the phone and my breath caught in my throat when I saw the name on the screen. Daniel. My husband never called me at this hour. I sat up, my pulse hammering. Ryan propped himself on his elbow. "What's wrong?" I shook my head, unable to answer, and hit accept. "Hello?" My voice came out steadier than I felt. Daniel's voice was calm, but there was something off about it. "Where are you?" I swallowed hard. I'm at the store, just picking up a few things." Silence. A long, suffocating silence. Then finally, "Come home. We need to talk." The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my hands shaking. Ryan sat up beside me. "Esther?" I looked at him, my heart pounding. I think he knows. The drive home felt like an execution. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind racing with possibilities. What does he know? How much has he figured out? I kept telling myself to stay calm, to come up with an excuse. But I knew deep down, there were no more excuses left. I had been sloppy, careless, and Daniel had noticed. When I pulled into the driveway, the house looked the same as it always had. Silent, waiting. I stepped inside, closing the door softly behind me. The air felt thick, heavy with tension. Daniel was sitting at the dining table, his hands folded in front of him. A glass of whiskey sat beside him, barely touched. I had seen this look before, the quiet before the storm. "Sit down," he said. His voice was calm, too calm. I obeyed, lowering myself into the chair across from him. For a moment, we just sat there, staring at each other. Then he slid his phone across the table. I looked down, and my stomach dropped. There, on the screen, was a message I had sent to Ryan. "I miss you already." I felt my breath leave my body. "Say something," Daniel said, his voice eerily steady. I swallowed hard. "Where did you get this?" His jaw tightened. "Your phone was unlocked this morning. I saw the messages." A cold chill ran down my spine. He had seen everything. I opened my mouth to speak, but nothing came out. There were no lies that could save me now. "How long?" Daniel asked, his voice quieter now. I lowered my head, shame flooding through me. "A few months?" He exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. "With who?" I hesitated. He let out a bitter laugh. "I already know. I saw his name. Ryan." Hearing Ryan's name from his mouth made my betrayal feel even heavier. "You lied to me," Daniel continued, shaking his head. "Every night you laid next to me, pretending." I closed my eyes. "I'm sorry." "Sorry?" His voice cracked. "You destroyed our marriage, Esther." "For what?" Tears burned in my eyes. I was lonely. He slammed his hand on the table, making me jump. "And you think I wasn't?" I looked up at him, shocked. "You think I didn't notice how distant we've been?" he said, his voice breaking. "I knew we were falling apart, but I never imagined this." A painful silence settled between us. Then finally, he spoke again. "Do you love him?" The question hit me like a bullet. Did I? Ryan made me feel alive, seen, wanted. But love? I didn't have an answer. "I don't know," I whispered. Daniel's face crumpled, and something inside me shattered. Because in that moment, I realized what I had done. I hadn't just betrayed my husband. I had broken him. The rest of the night was a blur. Daniel didn't scream. He didn't throw things. Instead, he stood up, walked to the liquor cabinet, and poured himself another drink. And then, without looking at me, he said, "I don't know if I can forgive you, Esther." His words were like a knife to my heart. I had spent years feeling invisible in this marriage. But at that moment, I wished he couldn't see me at all. I stayed up all night, sitting on the edge of our bed, staring at the empty side where Daniel should have been. I knew that things would never be the same. I knew that no matter what happened next, whether he chose to stay or to leave, something between us had died, and I had been the one to kill it. The next morning, Daniel packed a bag and left. He didn't yell. He didn't demand answers. He just walked away. And as I stood in the doorway, watching my husband of 32 years drive off without looking back, I felt the full weight of my choices crash down on me. I had chased passion, and I had found it. But at what cost? I was 58 years old, and for the first time in my life, I was truly, painfully alone. What would you have done in my place? Have you ever risked everything for a moment of passion? If my story made you feel something, if it made you think, then like and subscribe, because life is full of choices, and some of them can change everything.